What's up everybody, Lore here, and today I'm doing a review of the Logitech G600 MMO gaming mouse. This is about $80 US, and it actually ends up being about 70 pounds in the UK, which is actually about $110 US, so that's kind of ridiculous, but still, $80, 70 pounds. It comes in black or white. This is obviously the black version. I'm doing a little bit of a different review today. A lot of people will do like just an unboxing or something, or they'll do a real quick overview of the mouse. I've actually been using this for about 2 to 3 weeks now. I want to say it's pretty close to 3 weeks that I've actually been using this thing, which means that I've had time to pretty much run it through the ringer. So I wanted to go through and give you guys my impressions on how it holds up over time. A lot of gamers, when you buy something like this, you don't necessarily care about all the individual setup, the different things that you can come with it right out of the box, how it works right away. You want to know that it's going to be something dependable, especially if you're dropping 80 bucks on this thing. So that's what this review is going to be all about. I'm also going to be comparing it to the Razer Naga, which is another mouse that is very, very similar. Obviously, a lot of people have just been calling the G600 the Logitech version of the Naga. So I'm going to be doing a comparison between the two in detail a little bit later on in this review. Now, real quick before I go any further, just to get this stuff out of the way right away, if you're a Mac user, apologies, there is no Mac support for the G600, unfortunately, at least at the moment there is not. And if you're left-handed, you're a bit out of luck as well. They have publicly stated they are not planning on releasing a left-handed version of the G600. I'm not actually sure why. It seems like that would just be a great idea. Eventually somebody's going to make left-handed peripherals and immediately corner that entire market. But unfortunately, that is what Logitech has decided. So there's no Mac support and no left-handed support either, unfortunately. Alright, so let's start out with a bit of an overview of the mouse itself, just sort of looking the thing over. The build quality is pretty solid. It's a bit of a weight to the mouse. It's definitely a little bit heavier than the Naga, not by a ton, but a little bit. And overall, it's about what we've come to expect out of Logitech in terms of build quality. Very, very well put together. Just sort of overall, the whole thing, very, very solid. The only little weirdness I actually noticed, I'm not sure if you can see. I guess if I angle it like this, you can see it. This little bit doesn't actually line up exactly where it's supposed to. I mean, it clicks okay. There's no problems there. Whoops, accidentally. There we go. It clicks just fine. But, I don't know, it's just a bit weird. Kind of this extra, it seems to like it sticks out a little bit extra on there. But other than that, I have had zero problems with the actual build quality of the mouse itself. In terms of numbers of buttons, we have obviously left click, right click. We have this third G-shift button over here, which I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later on. We have a fully functional tilt wheel, so it's incremental, so it's actually a little individual click for each. Oh, there's something on my mouse. That's disgusting. Whatever. Individual little click. We'll just hide that. Individual little click for each individual scroll. It's also a tilt wheel, so you click it left or you click it right. I've generally not been a huge fan of tilt wheels in the past, but that's what we've got to deal with here. So that's a total of, let's see what it's called, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 buttons plus the scrolling. We have 2 more buttons up here to bring it up to 8, and then we have the 12 buttons on the side for a grand total of 20 buttons. And every single one of those is fully customizable. I'll be talking more about the customization in a minute, but every single button is fully customizable on the G600. So that's quite a few buttons to actually end up using if you are an MMO gamer. One other thing I want to mention, the cord, because I had a couple people asking about it. It's got this little braided, not sure if you can see it in there. Yeah, I guess you can. Little braided thing like you've seen in a lot of other mice. In fact, it's actually very similar to what the Naga has in terms of a braided cord. So that's very nice. Very, very strong and sturdy looking cord. Haven't seen any problems with that at all either. Size-wise, I guess the best thing I can do is just do a quick comparison. Again, I'm going to be going into detail with a comparison to the Naga later, but let's look at the size here. If I hold them up like this, you can see they're actually pretty close in size, especially vertically. In terms of height, they're actually right, let me make sure I got this lined up right. Yeah, they're right about the same height. So that was interesting to find out because the G600 in pictures looks enormous, but it's actually about the same height as the Razer Naga. It is a little bit wider than the Naga. That's entirely because of this extra button over here that you sort of rest your third finger on. Is a little bit wider than the Naga, but otherwise it's about the same size. So if you have very, very tiny hands, and the Naga was the perfect size for you. Probably still better size. If you have very large hands and the Naga felt too small, you may actually find yourself much happier with this mouse in general. In terms of hand feel, it actually feels pretty solid in my hand. I use the fingertip grip. If you're familiar with the different grip sizes or grip positionings that people have named for how you hold your mouse, I use a fingertip grip, so I'm very, very lightly pushing things around side to side. And it does move very, very smoothly. If you look on the bottom of it here, it's actually just got two big Teflon contacts here on the bottom, instead of, again, like the Razer Naga has this ring around the outside. That is disgusting. I'm very sorry about that. It has this ring around the outside. It just has these two big Teflon contacts. And strangely enough, only having those two contacts and like having nothing along these edges here, the G600 seems to actually move smoother for me on my mouse pad here. This is a Steel Series. It's actually a Rift mouse pad, but it's a Steel Series basic mouse mat. And it moves really, really smoothly. The cloth mouse mat that I'm sitting on here moves very, very smoothly back and forth. I was kind of surprised to find how smoothly it moves, especially considering there was a little bit extra, like I said, a little bit of extra heft to the mouse. It's not heavy by any stretch of the imagination, but it does have a little bit more weight. Again, your third, let me try and swing my arm around here. Your third finger is going to rest on this button, which means that you do a lot more pushing with your pinky. Previously, I would hold my mouse about like this, and push with my ring finger, so that was something I had to get used to with it, but it wasn't a big deal once I actually got used to it. One other thing I wanted to mention, because I know a lot of people have had questions, generally been concerned about, are you going to accidentally push the buttons on the side of the mouse? I haven't had that problem at all with this one. I didn't have it with the Naga either. I haven't had this problem with this at all. It does take a little bit of a squeeze to actually push any of these mouse buttons. Not a ton, right? It's not a huge amount of effort. You're not going just exerting yourself like crazy trying to push any of the mouse buttons down. But it is something that you have to actually decide, now I want to push this button, to actually be able to push any of them. It's not something that you're going to be accidentally, like I can even just tap it to move it over here like this. And it takes more pressure than that to actually push down any of the mouse buttons. Again, that's with my sort of fingertip grip style of holding the mouse, just sort of lightly pushing things side to side. If you use a palm grip, you're probably still fine, you know, just putting your hand on it and moving it around like this. You're probably still fine in that regard. If you use the claw grip, where you're just sort of grabbing a hold of the thing like crazy and sort of holding it, you may have issues with accidentally pushing the mouse buttons from time to time, but that's not a problem that I've had, and it just depends on how tightly you grip your mouse if you use a grip like that. In terms of being able to reach the buttons on the side, I've actually found that pretty manageable as well. One of the important things to note about the buttons on the side here is they're actually separated out. If you can see, I guess if I angle it like that, you can probably see it pretty well. It's actually separated out into two groups of 6, which I felt was extremely nice in terms of actually being able to hold it, because it means when you're just sitting here like this, you can easily feel which section you're on. It's like there's a rest point here, essentially, where you can easily reach any of these buttons, and there's another rest point back here where you can easily reach any of these buttons. Again, I'm going to compare with the Naga in detail a little bit more later, but that's something that I definitely liked about this mouse. Last thing to mention in terms of just the general overview of the product itself before I move on, I wanted to talk about this tilt wheel for a second. Like I mentioned, I'm generally not a fan of tilt wheels, but as far as tilt wheels go, this one is actually really, really well put together. It feels very, very solid. I've had tilt wheels in the past that felt like super floaty and like you'd accidentally bump them all the time, or you'd go to like click in the middle mouse button and accidentally slide it side to side as well. This tilt wheel is very, very solid. You have to actually be exerting pressure. Not a significant amount of pressure, again, it's just a mouse, but you do have to actually be thinking about, I want to push that in that direction to be able to actually use it. And again, like with clicking it down or with scrolling it as well, same general feel, because it is an incremental scroll wheel, it's not a free-rolling scroll wheel, which is good for a gaming mouse, for sure. I'm still not a huge fan of it being a tilt wheel in general, just because this motion, the left tilt, feels a little bit weird to actually try and pull off in the middle of doing something. Like you have to kind of pull your, like it feels weird for me to try and do that with my middle finger. I usually have used my index finger for using the mouse wheel, and coming over all the way over there, it just feels like something that's kind of obnoxious to try and pull off in a hurry. I haven't had any problem with the left or the right angle tilting, but the left angle tilting, it just feels a little bit weird to me. Again, that's mostly just personal preference. I don't really like tilt wheels a whole lot, but I have found this overall to be a tilt wheel that I can at least live with. So let's talk customization. Like I mentioned, this thing has 20 buttons, all of which can be configured. For starters, let's go through the default setups. It comes with 3 different loadouts, and you can customize every single one of these loadouts. It comes with 3 loadouts as a default. The starting one, which is this sort of pulsing through all the different colors sort of thing you can see going on here on the number buttons on the side there. The basic default setup, the number 1 loadout, is just a generic MMO, is what they're calling it, just a generic MMO setup. And what that means is obviously you have like left click, right click. These don't ever change up here. Left click, right click, mouse 4, mouse 5, mouse 3 is clicking in the mouse button. And then the buttons on the side here are all bound to 1 through $, just like it was the number row on your keyboard. That's what these are all bound to. I know a lot of people like to play with these mice like that and use these for their main skills. I generally don't like playing that way, but that is the default option. These buttons on the top, the G8 button here, this little tiny one, is what you actually use to switch through the different loadouts. And then this G7 button in the MMO setup, for whatever reason they decided the best way to set that up as the default is actually Shift B, like you're opening your bags in World of Warcraft. Kind of a weird, semi-arbitrary feeling little keybind there, but whatever, that's what the default keybind is. So you've got 1 through $, over here on the side. All of these buttons are what you expect. This is to switch your loadout to a different loadout. This is Shift B. Now the G Shift button on the side here essentially operates as a control modifier, but not really. See, the way you actually bind stuff up on this is when you have something bound to G Shift, which again is what these are in the default loadout. When you have something bound to G Shift, that just changes what the other keybinds are on the mouse. So it's not like you're holding down the control button. All it does is actually just change what the other keybinds are. So you hold down the G Shift button, and if you were to push any of these buttons on the side, it's now Control 1 through $, instead of just 1 through $. Then if you let off, obviously it goes right back. So that's an interesting little aspect of the G Shift button. You don't really have to bind it as though it's an extra key. It just lets you change what all the other keybinds are, as though you were using it like a modifier key. Moving on to the next keybind setup, if I push this loadout button here, this plain white boring, seriously I have no idea why they just picked plain white and boring for the second setup. This is their secondary MMO setup. And this is how I actually like to have things set up. There was a similar setup on the Naga. It sets things up. These buttons are now your number pad buttons. Everything else is essentially the same, but these are your numpad instead of your 1 through $. And I like that because, again, I like to be able to still use the keyboard. In my case, I use an N52, but I like to still be able to use that for my 1 through $, for my actual keybind actions. And I like having these just be sort of separate things that I can use for emergency buttons, or for buttons that I'm not going to push terribly often. So like Hellstone, or Potions, or Avenging Wrath, or, you know, like, I believe this I have bound to Divine Plea, this I have bound to Divine Guardian. Just random stuff that I'm not going to, like, I'm going to want to use during the course of a fight, but isn't something that I'm going to wanting to be using. Isn't something that I'll want to be using often. There we go. Spit that one out for you. So that's how I like to have this set up. I actually use that setup for my MMO gaming, for when I'm playing World of Warcraft or any other MMORPG for that matter. And like I said, the rest of the buttons are still the same. This is still the weird Shift B to open your bags. That's kind of weird. This is still essentially holding down Control. It does become Control plus numpad instead of Control plus one of the number buttons, but it still is essentially just working as Control. Now the last default loadout is actually really, really interesting. I didn't realize that was going to be in here, but it's a nice little way for them to nod to people who play other games. If you go into what they call the generic gaming setup, I call it the FPS setup because that seems to be about what it's set for. It's this green pulsing look on the side of the thing. Again, this is just the default setup, but the way it works, these are now 1 through 6. This first 6 buttons here are 1 through 6. These buttons over here, I believe this one is bound to E, which I know is in a lot of first-person shooters is like use things or so on. These extra buttons down here, these 3, are for actually changing the DPI on the fly, is what that turns into. So you can speed up, like if you want to go into precise aiming mode or something, you can speed up or slow down your DPI on your mouse. This just sets it back to default. This toggles the DPI it's on, so you can actually, instead of being the Shift B backpack or whatever, you can actually like toggle through different modes. But the most interesting thing about this setup, the most interesting thing and why I call it the FPS setup, is what it does with the G Shift button. Instead of turning it into a like an extra modifier key for everything else. Holding down this button actually lowers the DPI of the mouse. So you can slide back and forth, and then you hold down this button, and it's like a toggle switch. Like as you're holding that down, the DPI is lowered quite a bit, which is really, really cool to use in an actual game. Like I've been playing a lot of DayZ, a lot of Ravaged lately, sort of first-person shooter-esque sorts of games. And it's nice to be able to just on the fly, like if I'm trying to snipe somebody with a gun that maybe isn't particularly intended for sniping, I'm just trying to pick them off from a long range, I can hold this down and get more precise aiming because I'm not zoomed in super close. So it's easier to actually line up those shots when I hold down this button and get some more precise aiming for just a second. And of course, it being positioned there right next to the right mouse button, which is quite often used for iron sights and stuff like that, ends up feeling very, very fluid. I just hold down both of these buttons and I can let off and do so on and so forth. It just feels really, really solid in that regard. So I thought that was really cool, that it works out so well in other games and that it has this extra function just to kind of give it an edge over other non-gaming mouses in terms of actual like FPS gameplay, games that aren't World of Warcraft, aren't MMORPGs. I thought that was pretty cool. Now, of course, all of those loadouts, all three of those loadouts can be fully customized. There is some software that you can download from the Logitech website and go in and customize every single one of these default loadouts. I believe you're still stuck with 3 no matter what, but you can customize them any way you want. You can even go in and change the colors. So I've been thinking really hard about changing this default boring white into something else. I may actually end up going the BioWare route and going green and then red and then blue or something like that. But anyway, there is a full software. You can customize absolutely everything. Every single one of these buttons you can customize. You can customize even like if you really wanted to, you can customize the G shift button so that it changes what the left and right click do if you want it. Every single button is customizable and changeable. In fact, if you only wanted to use one loadout, you could even go in and change the loadout switch button into something else if you wanted. So that's very nice to see. You can customize everything there is about that. I'm going to do a follow-up video on the software itself. I don't want to go fully into the software in this little review, but it is the software. The software is there. You can customize pretty much everything there is about this mouse, again, even down to just the coloring on the side. So that's good to see as well. Alright, so let's get into a bit more of a direct comparison between the G600 and the Razer Naga. I know a lot of people are playing with the Naga already and saying, well, why should I consider picking up a G600? And honestly, if you're happy with the Naga already, I would say don't worry about it. There's not a big enough jump between the Naga and the G600 to really say, I need to run out and buy the G600 right now. Again, the only reason I would actually really recommend that is if you just really, really like that FPS setup with the sensitivity toggle, the DPI toggle on the G shift button. That's pretty cool. But for just generic MMO gameplay, I really don't see any major reason you should immediately jump out and buy the G600 if you're happy with the Naga. Again, looking at the size, it's pretty close in terms of size. Let me try and get a better shot of it here for you. Pretty close in terms of size. It is a bit weirder to actually hold at first, the G600, because of this extra button over on the side that sits about where on the Naga that's what I would use to hold it before, and obviously I still have my pinky back here, but it's about like if you were to just stick out your third finger on the Naga is about how it feels. So it ends up feeling a bit wider, quite a bit wider. I have wide hands, so it works out well for me, but if you have very small hands and the Naga felt perfect for you, I feel like the size on the Naga would probably be better for you. If you have larger hands like I do, this is actually great, and personally I feel the G600 feels much better in my hand as a result. In terms of weight and movement, like I mentioned earlier, there's a little bit more of a heft to the G600. It does feel a little bit heavier than the Naga. Not by a ton. And in terms of just pushing them around on the mouse mat, it feels pretty similar. In fact, I'd mentioned this earlier, I found it kind of weird that even though the Naga has this completely encircling the Teflon pad on the bottom of it here, the G600 with its just 2 Teflon pads, for whatever reason, it ends up feeling a bit smoother. It's actually easier for me to push the G600 around than it is for me to push the Naga, which, again, I found kind of strange. But it does actually feel a little bit easier for me to push the G600 around, which is good because, like I said, it does have a little bit more heft to it. So if it was about the same, I feel like I would actually just it would tire my wrist out trying to push this thing around. The side buttons, I had somebody ask me this. The side buttons are actually bigger on the G600. I don't know if you can tell from that, but they are actually a little bit bigger on the G600. And again, I found them very easier, a lot easier to find in a hurry because of that. Like I was talking about earlier, how they're separated out into 2 groups of 6. I found it very easy to be able to quickly go, okay, this is that button. Like, this is Blessing of Sanctuary. A big problem that personally I've been having. This is Blessing of Sanctuary. Excuse me. This is Blessing of Sacrifice, not Sanctuary. Blessing of Sacrifice, and this is Lay on Hands. And when I'm trying to find those in a hurry on the Naga, those 2 buttons are in such a weird place that I would just go and I would hit like whatever my thumb happened to come across first. And yes, there are these little ridges, people will mention this, there are these little ridges on the Naga that's supposed to make them easier to find. In a hurry, I don't always recognize what those are. I can't tell the difference between one of those ridges and whether it's just the side of one of these buttons down here. So I was constantly hitting the wrong button trying to use Blessing of Sacrifice, or excuse me, Hand of Sacrifice, I guess is what it's called nowadays, which led to quite a few of Rickatron deaths because I wasn't using my Hand of Sac on him. Haven't had that problem with this one at all. Once I got used to the separation of the 2 groups of 6, it's easy for me to go, oh, okay, right there it is. I go back, and it's right there. Just slide my thumb back, and it's right there, easy for me to find. And Lay on Hands, easy to find as well. I believe this is Ardent Defender, and these I've actually been using for Ventrilo keybinds. Side note, people were asking if you can keybind them as Ventrilo keybinds. Yes, you can. They're basically just keys on the keyboard. They're not like extra mouse buttons or anything, so you can bind them as you would any key on the keyboard. So anyway, I definitely have found the mouse buttons on the G600 to be much easier to find. If you were having that problem with the Naga where you just kind of had this grid of buttons and you're like, okay, I don't know which one is which, the G600, they're much easier to grab in a hurry. So that was very nice to see. I liked that very much. Mouse 4 and Mouse 5, you can see my mouse, I believe that's Mouse 4 on the Naga, has been worn down quite a bit at this point. I've obviously put quite a bit of time into the Naga as well. They were situated up over here on the first series Naga. They've since moved them back here, essentially where these buttons are on the G600. They've since moved them back here. I didn't have a problem with them being positioned up over here. It was a bit weird for me to get used to, but I got used to it without too much trouble. Those are the tilt scroll wheel on the G600. So ultimately, like, all things considered, I mentioned before that I don't really like tilt wheels, but the Mouse 4 and Mouse 5 functions are actually quite a bit easier to use on the G600 because they are part of that tilt scroll wheel. Much easier to get to in a hurry and just be able to flip them than over here where it's kind of like counterintuitive after, especially if you're like playing for a long time. My hand would start to slide back here if I was using a lot of these back buttons, and I'd be clicking, like, I'm still clicking obviously, but I'd have to suddenly reach way up over there to actually hit that button, which is why I didn't have it bound to anything super urgent. I feel like I don't have to worry about that so much with this, other than you will occasionally accidentally scroll the mouse wheel while trying to hit the side button. So that's one thing to think about. I do think that the 4 and 5 are easier to get to on the G600 as being part of that tilt wheel. And just comparing number of buttons just in general, there are 17 customizable buttons on the Naga. There are 20 customizable buttons on the G600, so that's a +3 automatically. Now you might say, well, you know, this is for changing loadout, and this is for the G-shift function. But that G-shift function means that every single one of these other buttons can be 2 buttons essentially. You can hold this down and have 2, like this is control numpad now on my side here. So that I really feel like in terms of overall customizable buttons, the number of buttons available to you, that's a very clear win for the G600. The Naga, I mean, it has a lot of buttons for sure. 17 is a lot of buttons, and most people will have a hard time, a lot of people, I should say, will have a hard time finding a use for the 17 buttons on the Naga. But if you just really want a ton of buttons, I feel like the G600 is a very clear winner in that regard. You're able to do so much more in terms of customization. It does take a little bit of getting used to the G-shift button. It is a little bit weird to have to think about in the middle of combat, but it does actually end up working out to be quite a major factor in terms of how many or how much stuff you can actually do with the G600. So overall comparison between the two, like I mentioned before, if you love the Naga, you don't need to run out and pick up a G600. There's nothing about this that immediately says, oh, I have to go grab that mouse. That's the best thing I just really need this mouse right now. If you love the Naga already, if you have one and you're happy with it, you're fine. You don't need to go out and spend the extra money on the G600. If there are things that you're kind of iffy about with the Naga, I feel like the G600 solves a lot of the design issues that I had personally with the Naga. It feels a bit wider, which just feels better in my hand. It's not quite so tiny as the Naga. I don't like the positioning of these buttons. I feel like even though I don't like the tilt wheel in the G600, it's still a better choice than having the buttons way up over here or the back down here. Like this is a very weird spot for me to try and reach naturally at any point anyway. I feel like that would just be awkward to have them there. One other thing I wanted to mention actually is the finish on the mice. The Naga, as you may already know, has Razer's sort of rubberized plastic sort of coating to it. It feels kind of rubbery, but it's just plastic. Like you can see where I've worn it off, it's just plastic with a rubbery coating on it. The G600 is just plastic whole way through, just hard plastic. And I actually really like that about the G600. Having used the Naga for long periods of time, you know, you're getting in the middle of fights or whatever, you're having like it's a very serious time, serious fight or whatever, you're killing heroic Ragnaros or wiping heroic Ragnaros in my case, your hands get sweaty. And what happens when your hands get sweaty on a rubberized finish is it gets extremely greasy and grimy and just completely disgusting. If my hands start sweating on the G600, it gets damp. And then I wipe it off, and that's about the end of that. So I found for extended gaming purposes, the finish on the G600 is actually very nice compared to the Naga. Other than that, no major differences between the two that I would recommend saying dump your Naga right now, go out and pick up a G600, unless there's something else that I've been talking about in the review already that you think, oh, okay, so yeah, that's why the Naga, or excuse me, that's why the G600 is way better, or that's why the Naga is way better. In terms of comparison, very similar products overall. It's mostly a flavor difference between the two. Now, one last thing I wanted to mention about the G600 before I close up this review is this weird glitch I've been getting. And I'm including it because that's kind of the point of this longer review, is to see how things hold up over time, just see, like, make sure that we iron out all the kinks. And I've had this weird glitch with it. And I'm not 100% sure it's actually the fault of the mouse. It may be some sort of weird Windows 7 thing too. Again, I'm not 100% sure. But what happens is sometimes, especially I've noticed this while I'm playing League of Legends, I tend to click a lot while I'm playing League of Legends. I'm the guy who just sits there and spams the right click button the entire time. I'm just going click like crazy. So what happens is apparently, I'm not 100% sure on how things work out technologically, just in terms of the back-end interface. But apparently what happens is when you're clicking too often like that, sometimes the mouse will think you clicked twice when you only clicked once. And what happens then is it just sort of spazzes out. And in the case of the G600, what happens is it suddenly treats it as though I've done that. Like I've just shoved the mouse way off to the side. It gets this sudden, like, scrolling effect, which in the middle of a team fight in League of Legends is approximately the worst thing you could have happen, because suddenly you're no longer looking at anything that's going on. Or if you're running away like crazy, all of a sudden you scroll down like this and you're running right back into the team that's chasing you. I've actually had a few deaths to that in League of Legends, and then my team goes, "Why did you turn around and fight them?" And I go, "My mouse glitched." And that's the worst thing that possibly have happened at that particular point in time. Again, I'm not 100% sure this is the G600's fault. And I was actually able to set up a workaround for it. I've actually been running a program called Autohotkey with a plugin called Buggy Mouse. And what that actually does is anytime you were to click too fast, I believe it's set to 70 milliseconds. If you were to click twice inside 70 milliseconds, it just treats it as a single click. I haven't had it cancel out any double clicks ever. But it's apparently some weird thing that when it clicks too fast in rapid succession, again, I'm actually not capable of clicking fast enough to trigger the thing, but when you click too fast in rapid succession, the mouse flips out. And the weird thing about that is I actually had a very similar issue with the Razer Naga, and this is why I think it's not necessarily a problem with the mouse. It might be something else with just Windows 7 or something else that's going on. Because I had a very similar issue with the Razer Naga. A lot of people who have used the Naga for a long time know about the infamous Razer Naga double click issue, where sometimes you would left click and it would actually send 2 clicks. It would treat it as though it was a double click. And the Autohotkey setup that I'm using, the Buggy Mouse Autohotkey sort of fix for it, is actually something that a lot of people had said fixed their problem with the Razer Naga as well. So, again, not completely sure that that's a problem with the mouse. If you're using the Naga already and thinking of switching, and you haven't had the double click problem, there's a very real chance that you won't have the weird scrolling problem with the G600, because for whatever reason they seem to be triggered by the same glitch. But it is a glitch that I've noticed and wanted to include here in this review just for the sake of completeness, just because it is a weird thing that I came across in the past few weeks that I've been using this mouse. So that pretty much sums up this review. I've been very, very happy with this mouse overall. Again, I did have that weird glitch. I was able to solve that with the Autohotkey workaround. And you can find that, just search for Autohotkey buggy mouse if you need to set that up yourself. It's a very, very simple fix to actually include. It just is a little program that runs in the background and clears out any of those too fast double clicks. Other than that, I've been extremely happy with this mouse. Again, I actually very, very surprised by the FPS setup and that little G-Shift DPI toggle, which I found very, very awesome to have in a first-person shooter setup. Really feels like a very, very solid mouse overall. And again, I've been using it for the past 3 weeks. Haven't run into any major problems other than that weird glitch, which again I ironed out with the Autohotkey setup. And really the big thing for me is that it's a Logitech mouse. I still have, it's sitting over there, I'm not going to try and drag it over here. I still have my MX518 from like 8 years ago, which is a Logitech mouse that is still running. And I've generally been impressed by Logitech's build quality. Their mice just seem to hold up extremely well over the years, and I'm expecting that to be about the same with this mouse as well. I will definitely let people know if it does end up dying out on me at some point, though. So, if you have any further questions, please feel free to ask them. Like I said, I'm going to be doing a follow-up video to look through the customization software. If there's any other questions about the mouse, I'll be sure to answer those when I put that video together as well. Or you can hit me up on Twitter or Facebook. That's twitter.com/devillore and facebook.com/devillore. Thanks so much for checking out this review, guys. I'll see you later.